The Australian military deployed machine guns against birds, and the birds won. In November 1932, soldiers of the Royal Australian Artillery hauled Lewis guns into the wheat fields of Western Australia's Campion district under orders to wage war on emus. The operation carried official military designation. It had a commanding officer, Major GPW Meredith, of the Royal Australian Artillery. It consumed thousands of rounds of ammunition, and it failed so completely that the affair became an international embarrassment, a story so absurd it has been retold for nearly a century as dark comedy. But the real story isn't about emus. It never was. Behind the spectacle of soldiers chasing flightless birds across the outback lies a far uglier truth, one the Australian government worked hard to bury. The men who begged for military intervention weren't incompetent farmers. They were decorated veterans of the First World War, promised land and a future by a government that knew the land was barely habitable. What happened in those wheat fields wasn't a war against emus. It was the final betrayal of men who had already given everything. And the worst part, the detail that wouldn't fully surface for decades, is that the government knew exactly what it was doing from the start. After the armistice of 1918, Australia faced a problem shared by every allied nation: what to do with hundreds of thousands of returning soldiers. These men had survived Gallipoli, the Western Front, the mud and gas and mechanized slaughter of industrial warfare. They came home changed, many broken, all of them expecting the country they'd bled for to make good on its promises. The answer was the soldier settlement scheme. Across multiple states, the Australian government offered returned servicemen blocks of land, often accompanied by modest loans for equipment and seed. The pitch was simple: serve your country, and your country gives you a farm. A fresh start, independence. In Western Australia, thousands of veterans took up the offer. They were allocated parcels in regions like the Campion and Walgoolan districts, east of Perth, deep in the semi-arid interior. Many of these men had no farming experience whatsoever. They were infantrymen, sappers, stretcher-bearers. They knew trenches, not tillage. The government knew the soil was marginal. Internal reports from agricultural surveyors had flagged concerns about rainfall, soil quality, and the viability of wheat cultivation in these areas. Those reports were quietly shelved. The political imperative was clear: move the veterans out of the cities, where their unemployment and visible suffering were becoming a liability, and onto land where they would be someone else's problem. The veterans cleared scrub with hand tools. They pulled stumps, broke ground, built rudimentary shelters. The work was brutal, performed under a sun that cracked the earth and blistered skin. Many worked alone, their nearest neighbor miles away, the isolation a stark mirror of the loneliness they'd carried home from France. For a few years, some of them managed. When the rains came, wheat grew. Not abundantly, not reliably, but enough to service debts and feed families. The margins were razor thin. One bad season could wipe out a year's income. 2 bad seasons could mean ruin. Then the Depression hit. Wheat prices collapsed. By 1929, the commodity that these men had staked their futures on was worth a fraction of its former value. Veterans who had borrowed against expected harvests suddenly owed more than their land was worth. Letters to the government went unanswered. Requests for debt relief were denied or delayed into meaninglessness. The men who had charged machine gun nests at Pozieres were now begging bureaucrats for extensions on payments they could never make. And then the emus came. Emus are migratory by instinct. Each year after breeding season, vast numbers of the birds moved westward from the interior toward the coast, following ancient routes carved by rainfall and food availability. When the soldier settlers cleared land and planted wheat, they inadvertently created an irresistible feeding ground directly in the emu's migration path. By 1932, an estimated 20,000 emus descended on the farming districts. They trampled fences, devoured crops, and left devastation in their wake. For men already on the edge of financial ruin, the emus were the final blow. Wheat that might have covered a season's debt was stripped bare overnight. The farmers petitioned the government. They needed help, fencing subsidies perhaps, or organized culling efforts. What they got instead was something no one expected. Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defence, and himself a senator from Western Australia, authorized a military operation. Soldiers would be dispatched with Lewis guns. The Emus would be mowed down. The problem would be solved. It was, on paper, a gesture of support. But what no one said aloud was the real calculus. Fencing the affected areas would have cost money. The government would have to budget and account for. Ammunition was already purchased and sitting in military stores. Sending soldiers cost almost nothing. The operation was never about helping the veterans. It was the cheapest possible response to a political headache. Major Meredith arrived in the Campion district on November 10, 1932, with 2 soldiers and 2 Lewis guns. The plan was straightforward. Locate large groups of emus, engage them, reduce the population to manageable numbers. The emus had other ideas. The birds proved remarkably difficult to kill. They scattered at the sound of gunfire, splitting into small groups that moved fast across open terrain. The Lewis guns, designed for suppressive fire against entrenched infantry, were nearly useless against targets that dispersed in every direction at 30 miles per hour. After the first engagements, Meredith's men had expended enormous quantities of ammunition for negligible results. Early reports claimed perhaps a dozen birds killed from hundreds of rounds fired. The press caught wind of the operation almost immediately. Australian newspapers covered the affair with a mixture of incredulity and mockery. The ornithologist Dominic Cervanti later observed that the emus had adopted guerrilla tactics, with small groups scattering and regrouping in patterns that frustrated every military approach. One account noted that individual emus absorbed multiple rounds and kept running. After 6 days, Meredith withdrew. The operation was suspended amid public ridicule. Parliamentary pressure and continued pleas from the farmers led to a second deployment in late November. This time, Meredith's team adopted different tactics: ambush positions near water sources, smaller engagements, more patient stalking. The results improved marginally. Over the following weeks, the military claimed approximately 986 kills from 9,860 rounds expended, roughly 10 bullets per bird. By December 1932, the operation was officially terminated. The government declared a modest success, but the numbers told a different story. 20,000 emus had prompted a military deployment, and fewer than 1,000 had been killed. The birds continued their annual migration through the wheat fields for years afterward. The veterans were left exactly where they'd started. Worse, actually, because the spectacle had transformed their genuine suffering into a national joke. The Emu War became a punchline. The serious questions about broken promises, marginal land, collapsed prices, and a government that had used its own veterans as political pawns were buried beneath layers of absurdist comedy. And that was precisely the outcome that suited certain people in Canberra. In the years following the Emu War, the soldier settlement scheme continued its slow collapse. Across Australia, roughly half of all soldier settlers eventually walked off their land. In Western Australia, the failure rate was even higher. Men who had survived the Somme lost everything to debt, drought, and indifference. The government offered no meaningful rescue. There were no debt forgiveness programs proportionate to the scale of the disaster, no acknowledgement that the land itself had been unsuitable, no admission that agricultural surveyors had raised concerns before the first veteran ever turned a spadeful of soil. When the scheme finally wound down, it was treated as an unfortunate experiment rather than a deliberate political maneuver. The veterans knew better. George Pearce, the same minister who had authorized the Emu War, had been one of the architects of the settlement scheme in Western Australia. The pattern was consistent. Promise land to quiet political unrest. Distribute the cheapest available acreage. When the settlers fail, offer the cheapest available response. When that fails, let the story become a joke so no one looks too closely at what actually happened. Some veterans wrote letters that survive in state archives. They are not funny. They describe men who couldn't sleep, who drank themselves into oblivion, who watched their children go hungry on land the government had assured them would provide. Several took their own lives. These deaths were not recorded as consequences of the settlement scheme. They were simply statistics, absorbed into the broader toll of a generation that had been used up and discarded. Today, the Great Emu War is a meme. It lives in listicles and Reddit threads, a quirky historical footnote trotted out whenever someone needs proof that truth is stranger than fiction. The comedy version is easy to digest. Soldiers versus birds. Birds win. Everyone laughs. But comedy is often the last layer of sediment deposited over something painful. Beneath the joke are men who were promised dignity and given dust. Men who fought one war for their country and lost another war against their country's indifference. The emus were never the enemy. The enemy was a system that treated veterans as instruments, useful when needed, disposable when not. Australia eventually moved to a bounty system for emu control, paying individual farmers per bird killed. It worked far better than the military approach and cost far less. The solution had been obvious from the beginning, but obvious solutions don't generate headlines, and they don't create spectacles large enough to distract from the real failure. The wheat fields of the Campion district are quiet now. The emus still migrate through each year, following routes older than any government, any war, any promise made and broken. The veterans are all gone. Their letters sit in archives that most people will never read. And the story that gets told, the one about the funny war with the birds, ensures that almost no one ever asks the only question that mattered. Why were those men out there in the first place?